Millionaire CEO forced into a fake marriage with his assistant, but she stole his heart. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The city skyline glowed under the drizzle of a late evening storm. On the top floor of a glass tower, Alexander Reed sat in his office, staring at the papers spread across his mahogany desk. He was 35 years old, the youngest CEO of Orion Global, and a man known for his ruthless efficiency. But tonight, his sharp eyes were clouded, his jaw tight with frustration. A crisis loomed over him, one that money alone could not solve. His board of directors had made their position clear. Without a wife by his side before the merger was finalized, they would consider him unfit to lead the company his father had built. A knock at the door broke the silence. Claire Bennett, his personal assistant, stepped inside, holding a stack of files against her chest. Claire was 26, determined, and far too good at her job. She had worked her way up from an entry-level position with sheer persistence and endless nights. But beneath her professionalism was someone just barely holding life together. Her younger brother's medical bills, the looming threat of losing their small apartment, and the weight of debt pressed down on her shoulders every day. She could not afford mistakes. Alexander looked up from the contract, his voice low and firm. "Claire, close the door." She obeyed, sensing the heaviness in the room. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, clutching the files like a shield. "There is something I need to ask you," he said slowly, the words feeling unnatural even as he spoke them. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the desk. "I need a wife, immediately. Not for love, not for family, but for business. Think of it as a contract, one that benefits us both." Claire blinked, sure she had misheard. Her heart pounded in her ears. "I am sorry, what did you just say?" Alexander's expression remained unreadable. "I am asking you to marry me, Claire. It would be temporary. You will attend events by my side, silence the board's doubts, and in return, I will pay off every hospital bill, every debt, and secure your future." The room seemed to tilt. The storm outside pressed against the glass with sheets of rain. Claire's throat tightened. She thought of her brother lying in a hospital bed, the stack of unpaid invoices waiting on her kitchen table, the landlord's warning that time had run out. It was insane. It was outrageous. It was everything she had sworn she would never do. Her voice trembled. "You want me to marry you for business?" Alexander's eyes met hers, cold steel softening just for a fraction of a second. "Yes. Think of it as a contract, nothing more." Claire's grip on the files loosened. A single thought cut through her panic. Maybe this was her only way out. The rain did not let up that night. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Claire walked home, her shoes splashing through shallow puddles on the cracked sidewalk. Her mind spun with Alexander's words. A proposal, but not for love. A marriage, but not real. It sounded like the plot of a movie, not something that could happen in her own life. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, trying to steady her heartbeat. When she reached her small apartment, the hallway lights flickered weakly. Inside, her brother Ethan lay in bed, with his textbooks scattered across the blanket. He looked up when she entered, his smile weary but warm. "Long day?" he asked. Claire forced a smile and set her bag down. "Something like that." She busied herself in the tiny kitchen, heating leftover soup, though her stomach twisted too much to eat. Ethan's cough broke the silence. The medical bills on the counter stared back at her like an accusation. She knew she was out of time. Later that night, lying awake in the dark, she heard the storm battering against the window. Alexander's voice replayed in her mind. Think of it as a contract. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but instead tears stung her eyes. Was this really her only choice? Pride screamed no, but desperation whispered yes. The next morning she dressed carefully, choosing her plainest blouse to remind herself who she was and what mattered. At exactly 9, she entered Alexander's office again. He looked up from his desk, already in a tailored navy suit, every inch the powerful CEO. His gaze sharpened when he saw her expression. "I have thought about your offer," Claire said, her voice steady though her hands trembled at her sides. "If this is truly a contract, I want to know the terms before I agree." "Oh." Alexander set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. A flicker of something unreadable passed across his face. Then he spoke clearly, like a man accustomed to negotiation. "There will be 5 rules. First, you will attend every business event with me as my wife. Second, you will live at my estate during the duration of the arrangement. Third, there will be no interference with my personal affairs. Fourth, you will keep the marriage confidential outside of official appearances. And fifth," his eyes narrowed slightly, "you must remember that this is not about feelings. It is business." Claire's breath caught. "So there is no room for anything real?" "Exactly," Alexander replied, his tone final. Silence hung heavy between them. Claire lowered her gaze, thinking of Ethan, of the eviction notice on their door, of the unpaid hospital bills. Slowly, she nodded. "Then I will do it." For a moment, the steel mask slipped from Alexander's face. Relief flickered there, quickly buried again. He pulled a thin document from his drawer and slid it across the desk. "The contract is ready. You will sign today." Her hand shook as she took the pen. Each stroke of her signature felt like carving away a piece of herself. When she finished, Alexander reached for the paper, folded it neatly, and locked it in his briefcase. "It is settled," he said simply. That evening, a black car pulled up outside Claire's apartment. The driver carried her modest suitcase into the back seat. Ethan hugged her tightly at the curb, his voice breaking. "Are you sure about this, Claire?" She whispered back. "It is the only way." The ride to Alexander's estate felt endless. The storm had cleared, leaving the city glistening under streetlights. But when the car turned into the private drive, Claire's breath caught. The mansion rose ahead like something out of another world, towering stone columns, sweeping gardens, windows glowing gold against the night. It was beautiful, but cold, like a palace without warmth. Alexander stood waiting in the grand foyer, his posture rigid, his eyes unreadable. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Reed," he said. Claire's heart pounded as the doors closed behind her. This was no fairy tale. This was a deal with the devil dressed in a tailored suit. And now, there was no turning back. The following days blurred together as Claire tried to adjust to a life that did not feel like her own. The mansion was vast, with rooms so large her footsteps echoed against marble floors. Polished chandeliers glimmered above her head, and portraits of Alexander's ancestors stared down at her with cold, watchful eyes. The staff moved silently, polite but distant, as though they had been instructed not to get too close. At dinner, Claire sat at the long mahogany table while Alexander took his place at the opposite end. Crystal glasses sparkled, silver cutlery was perfectly aligned, and a 3-course meal was served by a chef she never saw. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft clink of forks against porcelain. "You are settling in," Alexander said finally, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "It is different," Claire admitted. "This house feels like a museum, too perfect, too quiet." He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You will get used to it. Appearances matter, especially now." Claire bit her lip, glancing down at the plate of food she could hardly taste. Appearances. That was what this marriage was about. To the world, they were husband and wife. In reality, they were strangers bound by ink and desperation. The next morning, Alexander's assistant from the corporate office arrived with a stylist and etiquette coach. Claire sat stiffly as a woman pinned her hair into elegant waves, applying makeup with expert precision. Another instructor walked her through posture, conversation, and the endless list of social expectations that came with being Mrs. Reed. Claire felt like a doll being prepared for display. When she finally stood before the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. The plain blouses and worn shoes had been replaced with a fitted gown, heels that clicked against the polished floor, and jewelry that sparkled under the light. Her reflection looked like she belonged in Alexander's world. But inside, she felt more like an imposter than ever. That evening, she accompanied Alexander to their first public event as a married couple. The gala was held at a downtown hotel, filled with the city's elite. Journalists, investors, and politicians moved through the ballroom, their laughter blending with the hum of a string quartet. Cameras flashed as Alexander entered with Claire on his arm. She forced herself to smile, her heart pounding as whispers rippled through the crowd. She could feel the eyes on her, measuring, judging. A woman in a glittering red dress leaned toward her companion and murmured something behind a jeweled hand. Claire caught the word assistant and felt her stomach tighten. At the banquet table, a reporter approached with a too bright smile. "Mrs. Reed, how does it feel to be married to one of the most powerful men in the city?" Claire's throat went dry. The rehearsed phrases the etiquette coach had drilled into her fled her mind. Before she could stammer out an answer, a board member interrupted with a mocking laugh. "Powerful men always need a pretty face by their side. Do you agree, Mrs. Reed?" The words sliced through the air, cruel and dismissive. Claire's cheeks burned. For a moment, she wanted to shrink into the floor. But then she thought of Ethan, of the endless nights she had worked to pay bills, of every person who had ever doubted her worth. She lifted her chin and spoke clearly. "Power is not about appearances," she said. "It is about responsibility. And standing beside Alexander means standing beside the responsibility he carries for this company and its people. I am proud to do that." A hush fell over the table. The board members' smirk faltered, and a few reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Alexander's gaze lingered on her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Later, as the night wound down, Alexander guided her out of the ballroom. His hand brushed lightly against hers, not quite intentional, not quite accidental. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said quietly. Claire looked at him, surprised. "I only said what I believed." His lips curved, just slightly. "Belief is rarer than you think in this world." For the first time since the contract was signed, the distance between them felt a little smaller. Yet Claire knew this was only the beginning. Their marriage might have started as a lie, but beneath the polished surfaces and written rules, something unpredictable was beginning to stir. The weeks that followed became a blur of events, dinners, and endless appearances. Claire learned quickly how to play her part. She smiled when the cameras flashed. She shook hands with investors, and she laughed politely at jokes she did not understand. But when the gowns were returned to their closets and the glittering lights faded, she often found herself alone in the cavernous halls of the mansion, feeling more like a guest than a wife. One night, after a particularly long evening at a charity auction, Claire wandered out onto the balcony of the estate. The city glowed in the distance, skyscrapers sparkling against the night sky. She hugged her arms around herself, the cool breeze lifting strands of her hair. "You will catch a cold out here," a deep voice said behind her. She turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, the sharpness of his usual composure softened by fatigue. For the first time, he looked less like the untouchable CEO, and more like a man carrying too much on his shoulders. "I needed air," Claire admitted. "Sometimes it feels like I am suffocating in that ballroom." He stepped closer, his gaze following hers to the skyline. "You did well tonight." The investors left impressed. "Is that all this is to you?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Impressions? Contracts? Appearances?" Alexander's jaw tightened, but instead of anger, there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. He leaned on the railing, his voice low. "You think this is easy for me? You think I wanted this arrangement? Every move I make is dissected. Every mistake becomes a headline. If I appear alone, they see weakness. If I marry for convenience, they see calculation. Either way, I lose." His words startled her. For a moment, she glimpsed the man beneath the armor, the one who carried the weight of an empire but never allowed himself to falter. "Why me?" Claire asked quietly. Alexander turned his head, studying her. "Because you are strong enough to stand here and not run. Because you do not play games. And because—" He hesitated, the sentence unfinished. He shook his head as if pushing the thought away. "Forget it." The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the city below. Claire's chest tightened, but not from fear. There was something in his honesty, however brief, that drew her in. The following weekend, they attended a private dinner with the board of directors. It was meant to be routine, a chance to showcase unity, but tension hung in the air. One of the older members leaned across the table, his tone sharp. "Mr. Reed," rumors spread quickly. "There are whispers that this marriage of yours is nothing but a business arrangement. Care to comment?" Claire felt her stomach drop. This was the moment she had feared the test of their fragile facade. Before Alexander could respond, she placed her hand lightly over his, forcing herself to smile. "Our marriage is our business," she said calmly. "And I assure you, there is nothing false about my commitment to stand beside him." The board member smirked, unconvinced, but Alexander's hand tightened around hers under the table. His thumb brushed against her skin, a silent thank you. When they returned home that night, the tension between them lingered, but it was different now. Claire entered the library, a room she had never dared to step into before. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes. Alexander followed, removing his jacket and setting it on a chair. "You surprised me tonight," he admitted. "You defended me as if it mattered to you." Claire met his gaze steadily. "It does matter. I may have signed a contract, but I will not be a puppet." Something shifted in his expression. For a brief second, the distance between them seemed to dissolve. He stepped closer, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You are not a puppet, Claire. You are the only real thing in this entire arrangement." Her breath caught as the air thickened between them. The library was quiet, the storm outside muffled by thick glass, and yet Claire felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Alexander stopped short of touching her, his control ironclad, but his eyes said everything his words did not. In that moment, Claire realized the lines they had drawn, the rules, the distance were beginning to blur, and once blurred, there would be no going back. The days after the dinner with the board carried a different weight. Something had shifted between Claire and Alexander, something neither of them dared to name, but it lingered in every glance and every unspoken pause. She noticed it in the mornings when he left for the office, his eyes holding hers just a little longer than before. She noticed it at night when they returned from events, the silence between them softer, less guarded. One evening, after a long day of appearances, Claire found herself wandering into the garden of the estate. The air was cool, scented with roses, and the stone pathways glistened under the light of the lanterns. She sat on a bench, closing her eyes, trying to remember what her life had been before all of this. A waitress rushing between tables, a sister counting every dollar to pay bills, a woman who never imagined herself wearing gowns worth more than her old apartment. Footsteps sounded behind her. Alexander approached, his suit jacket draped over his arm. "You disappeared," he said lightly. "I needed quiet," she replied. "In this world, there is never silence. Just noise dressed up in chandeliers and champagne." He chuckled softly, sitting beside her. "Noise is better than emptiness. At least noise reminds you that you are not alone." She turned to him, surprised by the rawness in his voice. "Is that what this house feels like to you? Empty?" His gaze drifted over the darkened windows of the mansion. "It always has. I grew up here, but it has never felt like home. Just a place where I was expected to become someone important. And now, even at the top, it feels hollow." Claire studied him, realizing how much of his life was built on appearances. The ruthless CEO, the untouchable leader, the perfect image. But beneath it all, he was just a man carrying the burden of loneliness. For the first time, her heart ached, not just for Ethan, not just for herself, but for Alexander. The next week, they attended another gala. Claire had grown used to the rhythm of these nights: arrive, smile, endure questions, leave. But this evening held a new challenge. Alexander's former fiancée, Isabella, stood across the room, her beauty striking, her eyes sharp as glass. She approached with a smile that never touched her lips. "Alexander," Isabella purred, her gaze flicking to Claire with disdain. "So, this is your wife. How surprising." Claire felt the sting, but she stood tall. "It is nice to meet you," she said politely. Isabella's eyes narrowed. "I wonder how long this arrangement will last. Everyone knows contracts can be broken." The words were a knife, designed to cut. Claire forced her smile to remain, but her stomach twisted. Alexander's arm tightened protectively around her waist. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned. "Isabella, my marriage is not up for discussion. Enjoy your evening." They walked away, but the encounter left Claire shaken. Later that night, in the car ride home, she stared out the window, the city lights blurring past. She knows, she whispered. Alexander's jaw tightened. Let her think what she wants. The board trusts what they see, and what they see is us. Oh, but what happens if the truth comes out? Claire asked. His silence was heavy. At last, he said, Then I risk everything. But I will not let that happen. Back at the estate, the tension followed them inside. Claire changed out of her gown and wandered into the library, needing space to breathe. A few minutes later, Alexander entered, loosening his tie. His eyes softened when he saw her curled up on the sofa. You were strong tonight, he said quietly. Stronger than I deserved. Claire looked up, her heart pounding. You deserve more than a lie, Alexander. And I deserve more than being your shield. For a moment, neither moved. Then Alexander crossed the room, lowering himself to sit beside her. His hand hovered near hers, not quite touching. Yet the heat of it sent a shiver through her. His voice dropped to a whisper. Perhaps this has become more than a shield. Claire's breath caught. The contract, the rules, the cold distance, they were crumbling. And as his eyes met hers in the dim light of the library, she realized the dangerous truth. Somewhere between the lies and the appearances, she had started to fall for him. And by the look in his eyes, he had started to fall for her too. The fragile line between pretense and truth blurred further with each passing day. Claire began to notice the subtle ways Alexander's guard slipped when no one else was watching. In the mornings, he lingered at the breakfast table just a little longer than necessary, pretending to read the paper while stealing glances at her. At night, when they returned from events, his hand would brush against hers as though by accident, but he never pulled away too quickly. One late evening, after a corporate banquet, Alexander suggested they take the long way back to the estate. The driver guided the car through the quiet streets until they stopped at a riverside park. The night air was cool, the city skyline shimmering across the water. Alexander stepped out first, offering Claire his hand. She hesitated, then placed her palm in his, the warmth startling after so many weeks of formality. They walked slowly along the path, silence hanging comfortably between them. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Do you know why I work the way I do? Why I allow myself no rest? Claire looked at him, curious. Because you are afraid of losing control. He smiled faintly, surprised at her insight. Yes, my father built this empire and expected me to carry it without faltering. He used to tell me that emotions were weakness, that love made men foolish. I believed him for a long time, until lately. Her chest tightened. She wanted to ask what had changed, but the answer already hung unspoken between them. The following weekend brought another gathering, this time a private dinner hosted by one of the major shareholders. Claire had become adept at navigating these evenings, smiling when expected, listening more than speaking. But halfway through the night, the conversation shifted sharply. A shareholder raised his glass, smirking. Mr. Reed, some say your marriage is nothing more than a staged performance. What do you say to that? Claire froze. The words felt like daggers. Before Alexander could respond, whispers rippled around the table. Isabella was among the guests, her sharp gaze gleaming with satisfaction. Alexander's expression darkened. He rose to his feet, his voice steady but charged with steel. My personal life is not up for speculation. What matters here is the company, its growth, and its people. If any of you doubt my leadership because of my marriage, then perhaps you are not as committed to this company as I am. The room fell silent, the challenge hanging heavy in the air. Claire felt her pulse race. She reached for her glass, trying to steady herself, but her hand trembled. Alexander noticed, his eyes softening briefly before he resumed his commanding posture. Later, in the car ride home, Claire finally spoke. You cannot fight them forever. If the truth comes out, I will deal with it, Alexander interrupted, his jaw tight. But I will not let them humiliate you, not while you are my wife. His words struck deep. She turned to look at him, the city lights flashing across his face. He meant it. Despite everything, despite the contract and the rules, he was beginning to see her not as a prop but as someone he needed to protect. That night, back at the mansion, Claire slipped into the garden for air. She stood among the roses, staring at the sky, when she heard footsteps. Alexander joined her, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "You were brave tonight," he said quietly. "Even when they tried to tear you down, you held your head high." "I only did what I had to do," she murmured. He turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "No, you did more. You reminded me of something I had forgotten, that strength is not measured in money or power, but in courage." The air grew still between them. His hand lifted slightly, as though he wanted to touch her cheek, but he stopped himself, the invisible rules of their contract pulling him back. Yet the look in his eyes said what his lips could not. Claire's heart pounded as she realized that the walls they had built were crumbling faster than either of them could stop. And somewhere deep inside, a dangerous hope began to bloom. The fragile calm shattered just days later. Claire arrived at the office one morning to find a stack of tabloids spread across the reception desk. Her own face stared back at her from the glossy covers, alongside headlines screaming accusations. Marriage of convenience? CEO's assistant-turned-wife contract? Or true love? Her stomach dropped. Reporters clustered outside the building, their voices sharp with questions as flashes of cameras lit the air. Claire pushed through them, her pulse racing, until Alexander's head of security guided her inside. When she reached his office, Alexander was already there, standing at the window with the paper clenched in his hand. His jaw was tight, his eyes stormy. "They know," he said flatly. Claire's voice shook. "Who told them?" He turned, his expression grim. "Isabella. She has been digging since the day of the gala. Someone on the board helped her leak it. They want to use this to destroy me, to take the company while I am distracted." Her chest tightened. "Then the contract. It will ruin you." Alexander crossed the room, his voice low but fierce. "No, I will not let them win. But they will come after you, Claire. They will paint you as the desperate girl who sold herself for comfort. They will try to make you break." His words were not a warning. They were a vow. That evening, the mansion felt colder than ever. Claire sat in the library, staring at the fire as doubt clawed at her chest. She had signed the contract to save her brother, never imagining it would drag Alexander into scandal. Now, she wondered if she had been a fool to believe she could survive in his world. Alexander entered quietly, setting a folder on the table. "They are calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow," he said. "They will try to vote me out." Claire looked up, fear tightening her throat. "What will you do?" He held her gaze, his expression steady despite the storm raging around them. "I will fight, but not with lies anymore. If they want to see the truth, then they will." For the first time since the contract was signed, Claire saw the mask slip completely. He was not the untouchable CEO, not the cold strategist. He was a man willing to risk everything, even his throne, rather than let her be destroyed by their arrangement. As the firelight flickered across his face, Claire realized the contract had already ceased to matter. Whatever happened at that board meeting, their lives had already changed forever. The boardroom was tense the next morning, every leather chair filled, every eye fixed on Alexander as he walked to the head of the long polished table. Claire sat quietly at his side, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The walls seemed to close in, the air heavy with judgment. One of the senior directors cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed, your so-called marriage has become a liability. The press calls it a business contract. Investors are unsettled. We need stability, not scandal." Another chimed in, sharper. "Step down, Alexander. Hand the reins to someone whose personal life does not endanger the company." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. She glanced at Alexander, expecting him to retreat behind his usual mask. Instead, he rose to his full height, his voice carrying through the room like a steady drum. "You are right about one thing," he began. "This marriage did not begin like others. It started as an agreement, a contract. I will not deny it." Gasps rippled through the board, but he continued, unwavering. "What you are wrong about is the assumption that it remains only that. Claire has stood by me when it would have been easier to walk away. She has endured your whispers, your insults, and the scrutiny of the world. She has shown more strength and loyalty than anyone else in this room." Claire's throat tightened as every gaze turned toward her. Alexander did not look away. "So yes, the marriage began as business. But now? Now it is real. And if you want to take my position because I found love in a place you did not expect, then go ahead. But understand, this leadership is not about an image on a magazine cover. It is about integrity. And mine is standing beside me. The room fell into stunned silence. Some directors shifted uncomfortably, others exchanged uncertain looks. The man who had spoken first coughed, his voice less confident now. "We will reconsider. Perhaps it is best to wait until the scandal cools." Alexander sat down again, his hand brushing against Claire's under the table. For the first time, he did not pull away. Instead, he threaded his fingers through hers, firm and unshakable. As they left the boardroom, flashes from reporters' cameras erupted outside the building. Alexander paused at the doors, then did something no one expected. He turned to Claire, his voice low but audible to every microphone. "This woman is my wife, and I will not hide it. I will not apologize for it." Gasps and cheers erupted from the crowd. Claire's heart pounded as Alexander guided her through the chaos, his arms steady around her shoulders. For the first time since the contract was signed, she did not feel like a pawn in his world. She felt like a partner. That night, back at the mansion, the silence between them was different. No longer cold, no longer distant. When Alexander looked at her across the library, his expression was open, unguarded. "Claire," he said softly, "I meant every word." Her heart ached, not with fear this time, but with something far more dangerous: hope. Weeks passed after the board confrontation, and the noise of scandal began to fade. Headlines that once questioned their marriage shifted into curiosity, then into admiration. Investors calmed as the company's profits held steady, and the public began to see something genuine in the way Alexander and Claire stood together. One evening, Claire returned from visiting Ethan at the hospital. His health was improving, thanks to treatments now fully covered by Alexander's support. She entered the mansion to find the halls dimly lit and strangely quiet. A trail of candles flickered along the marble floor, leading her toward the gallery at the far end of the estate. When she stepped inside, Claire stopped short. The vast room had been transformed. Canvases lined the walls, her sketches, her paintings, pieces she had long ago tucked away in dusty folders. Alexander had found them and framed them, filling the gallery with her art. A sign above the entrance read, "The Art of Claire Bennett." Her breath caught as tears welled in her eyes. "Alexander, what is this?" He stood in the center of the room, dressed in a dark suit, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "It is my apology," he said simply. "For every time I reduced you to a contract, for every rule that kept you at a distance. You deserve to be seen for who you are. Not just as my wife, but as Claire, the woman who changed everything for me." She covered her mouth, overcome by emotion. "You did all this? For me?" He stepped closer, reaching into his pocket. In his hand was not the simple band from their contract marriage, but a new ring, glimmering under the candlelight. "That night in my office, I asked you to marry me for business. Tonight, I am asking you to marry me for real. No contracts, no conditions, just love." Claire's tears spilled as she nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms. The gallery around them glowed with the reflection of her artwork, a perfect backdrop to the life they were choosing together. Weeks later, their wedding was small but filled with warmth. Ethan stood proudly as best man, the staff of the mansion smiling genuinely for the first time. When Alexander and Claire exchanged vows, it was not for appearances, not for the board, not for the world. It was for themselves. As they walked out of the chapel hand in hand, the sun breaking through storm clouds above, Claire whispered with a smile, "The best mistake we ever made." Alexander kissed her forehead gently. "No mistake," he said, "only fate." And for the first time, the contract that had bound them was nothing more than a memory. What remained was love, real and unshakable, the kind neither of them had dared to believe in before.